Hello again. My name is David Putnam, and I'm the Director of Oregon Response to Instruction and Intervention. I joined you earlier in this course for Module 6, and I'm back again today to deliver Module 10, Tier 3 for Academics and Behavior. The objectives for today's module include starting with a review of the big ideas of MTSS as we're about to wrap up this course. It'll be a brief review, but just to orient us and get us focused in where we need to be for today's module. And then we'll define and describe individualizing and intensifying at Tier 3, as that is the primary organizing component for supporting students at Tier 3. Then we'll take a look specifically at individual problem solving for academics, and then we'll move to taking a close look at functional behavior analysis for behavior. So to go back and review just broadly, multi-tiered systems of support include academics and behavior, and you've been learning all about those two domains within MTSS over the course of this course. So if we take a little bit closer look, academic and behavioral systems really mirror one another in the three-tiered model, with that first tier, Tier 1, focusing on universal supports and interventions. In an academic model, that involves your research-based core curriculum and evidence-based instructional practices, as well as assessment and teaming practices that look at both the health of your core and then identifies students that need additional support. The very same is true on the behavioral side of the triangle, where we provide universal support for all students through a school-wide behavior system. So there are school-wide behavioral expectations posted in public places as well as in classrooms. And the key idea here is that it's instructional, just like for academics, in that we seek to teach and emphasize and reward those behaviors that meet those expectations. And there is a mechanism there too for looking at students that may need something more by monitoring behavioral performance. Oftentimes you look at ODRs, you look at attendance, and then in a more sophisticated and probably accurate way, you look at perhaps ratings of student behavior. And then when you do that, you can look at not only externalizing behaviors, but internalizing behaviors as well, which has been discussed earlier. Tier 2 in both systems addresses the needs of those students that need something more beyond the core, like we like to say. And Tier 2 supports typically are supports that involve evidence-based strategies, either academic intervention or behavioral interventions that are applied, delivered in addition to the core program. There again, you've got progress monitoring that identifies whether students are making progress, and it identifies those students that may need something more beyond those group-delivered interventions. Tier 3 is where we depart from either the large whole group interventions and supports or the group-delivered more intensive interventions and move to focus on the individual. This is where we stop teaming, looking at data that refer to groups of students, and we really focus in a very intense way on the individual needs of an individual student. So, what is intensive intervention? This definition comes from the National Center on Intensive Intervention. We at Oregon RTI are currently involved in a collaboration grant with NCII, as we call it, and it's a wonderful organization, part of the American Institutes for Research, and they provide support nationally to address the needs of students with the most intensive needs, both academic and behaviorally. So their definition involves the following components. They look at intensive intervention as addressing severe and persistent learning or behavioral difficulties. And the way that we address those difficulties is driven by data. No surprise there, as are all the functions in an MTSS system. But it's characterized by really increased intensity, either smaller groups for a greater deal of time at tier three that really focus in on just a small number of kids, two or three, and provide very direct instructional support, or individualization of behavioral supports for students that present with our most challenging difficulties. So it's intended for students that are not meeting their IEP goals. So these may be students that have already been identified as eligible for special education services, but are struggling to make progress. And those with high frequency and high intensity behavior needs, and those that have demonstrated inadequate response to previous tiered interventions. And that's a really key part of this definition. We want to make sure that before moving to tier three, that we really have delivered on group level interventions in a way that is appropriately targeted for that particular student, and that we've delivered that intervention with fidelity, so we know in fact that we have provided that intervention in a way that should be effective at meeting the student's needs, unless it's clear that they have needs that go beyond that and to a higher level. So that's a broad definition. And what's NCII's approach to intensive intervention? They refer to their intensive intervention and individualization at tier three as data-based individualization, or DBI. And it's really just a systematic method for using data to determine when and how to provide more intensive intervention. This is not something that is a newly developed concept or practice, and in fact goes back to the 70s. Dino and Merkin out of the University of Minnesota, and there was a great deal of work that was being done there around problem solving, around the development of the fundamentals of what would become curriculum-based measurement as we know it today, and a variety of other practices in a database problem-solving approach. And they have this approach, these approaches have really evolved greatly since that time, but still maintain their key fundamental characteristics from when they were first developed. Another important thing to note is it's a process, not a single intervention program or strategy. So this isn't something that is a standardized program like many reading interventions or some tier two behavior interventions where you're going to apply a set program. It's a process for identifying individual needs and appropriate supports. And it's also not just a one-time intervention. It's intended to be iterative in that we apply this, we look at the data, we look at its effects, and we continue to modify as needed. And it, in most all cases, is something that does evolve over time. So with that, let's look at just a graphic representation of the National Center on Intensive Interventions model for data-based intervention. Again, we really want to make clear, and as practitioners and educators, we want to make sure that we are providing validated intervention program at tier two, and that we can collect data and information to be sure that that program was delivered with fidelity, whether it's an academic intervention or a behavioral intervention. We progress monitor and look at the response. And many times at tier two, with many of those kids at that level, the response will be positive. I think I said in an earlier module that failure with a tier two intervention should be rare. And that is because those interventions are designed and are validated and have been demonstrated to be effective when delivered with fidelity. But there will be some students whose needs go beyond the level of that tier 2 intervention, and they do require something more. But that should be a small portion of your population, perhaps 5%. And if you're not careful to really deliver well at tier 2, then tier 3 can become flooded. And it's a labor intensive endeavor to individualize with this kind of intensity. And so tier 3 can become flooded, and it really will bog your system down. It's not appropriate for the students, and it's not appropriate for at the systems level. So, but we move from there with the students that are non-responsive to that individualization, where we're looking at diagnostic academic assessment or a functional behavioral assessment. And functional behavioral assessment, FBA, is a proper name, as it were, and we will get back to that later and define that for you and examine just how those functional behavioral assessments are conducted, and then plans are delivered to students. Like I said before, the DBI process is intentionally adaptive and iterative over time. So you apply the plan, and then you collect data, monitor progress, and evaluate whether or not the plan is effective, needs to be modified or changed in some way. And then you loop back through that system. So that's a visual graphic display of the basic process. And that really is the fundamental core concept that is being applied here, both for academics and for behavior. So the purpose of individual problem solving is not pre-referral. I think that oftentimes we find that school personnel and teams, when they're new to an RTI process, when they're new to a multi-tiered system of support process, there's this thinking that this methodology is another way of working towards referral ultimately for special education services. But we really do not want to think of it as a pre-referral process, but actually just the opposite, that we are really hoping and intending to prevent referral by solving problems in general education. Again, when these systems are set up and are being run effectively, and supports, core instruction, interventions are being delivered at a high level of fidelity, then we see tremendous growth for students at all levels. And in fact, it really works quite beautifully to prevent referral and address the needs of students at much lower levels on the continuum. Okay, so there's a general overview, a quick review of the MTSS system broadly, and then an overview of the basic concepts and components of intensive interventions at Tier 3. Now let's move to really a deeper dive, looking specifically at those intensive interventions applied to academics. And we will look at the model that we use here at Oregon RTI. And that's a model that we call individual problem solving. Our individual problem solving mirrors directly with the National Center for Intensive Interventions, so there's great conceptual convergence. What we have done, though, in our case is really built out that model with some very nice, I believe, and functional, useful, specific tools to conduct those that individual problem solving. So we talked a little bit about who those students are that require individual problem solving. So those are students that may already be identified with disabilities, students, students that who may not have a disability, and students with general significant deficits. And those students, again, that have not responded to Tier 2 interventions. Now, if many of your students need individual problem solving, then your whole system probably needs individual problem solving. Not individual, systems problem solving. And again, it gets back to that point that you really should be only identifying a small percentage, perhaps 5% of your students that really need to move to this level. And if that's not the case, you really need to go back and take a look at your overall system. Okay, so more specifically, let's look at how to identify those students that might require individual problem solving. So this is a graph that shows a student that has been receiving tier 2 interventions for reading. And you can see those blue lines are what we call phase lines. So in that first phase of intervention, the student was receiving phonics for reading for 30 minutes, standardized program, evidence-based. And if you look at um, the individual data points, either the black circles or black circles in red, compared to that blue dotted line, which is the aim line, you can see that the student is not making adequate progress to get them to close the gap with the target. So data was collected, the team met again, they evaluated the performance and saw that there was a need for increasing the intensity of that intervention. So an additional program, Read Naturally, was also delivered for the student, and that accounted for 45 minutes of total time in intervention on a daily basis. Um, and it's important again to note that these tier 2 interventions need to be, like I said before, have an evidence base already, and they need to be delivered on a significant time frame, on a significant basis. We often hear people talk about tier 2 interventions where a student might be getting an additional 15 minutes twice a week and not making good progress. And so then at that point referred on for special education evaluation. And the truth of the matter is that just clearly isn't enough to really impact performance and move students forward in a significant way. But this level of intervention, both in terms of the programs and the time that's being devoted, really should be making a difference for most students. And if the student isn't responding after this, it's a pretty good indication that it's time for individual problem solving. The student needs something more, and oftentimes what the student may need goes beyond just that target of reading and good intensive support for reading in particular. And individual problem solving, again, is where you move from that group level of analysis to an individual level where you focus on just that individual and your data collection and your teaming practices, and you look much more broadly to it what the needs of those students are. So you go beyond just reading and interventions that might address, their skill deficits, and you take a closer, deeper dive and look at their needs more broadly and in a more detailed way. One question you always want to ask when you're evaluating tier 2, be patient, we'll move to tier 3 real quickly, but this is all important from a systems level. So before you decide that that student really isn't making progress because of the degree of their individual need, you need to determine whether or not that intervention was really being delivered as intended. And one way to do that is to carefully look at the data from all the students that are in that intervention group. And you look at that data to see if it's the lack of progress is just for the student in question, in this case Jackson, or if it's true for all the students. So if you've got 4 students in an intervention group and none of those students are making adequate progress, then it really is not likely an individual child problem. There may be concerns or issues with the way that intervention is being delivered. And so you'd want to then go back and really look carefully at the amount of time that was in which the program was actually being delivered, and was it being delivered with fidelity to the program, et cetera, because it's not likely an individual child problem. On the other hand, if you look at the student that you're focused on and concerned about, and you compare them to the other students in that group intervention and you see that they are making adequate progress, then you can have a great deal of confidence that the issue is for that student and not with the delivery of the program. So that's an individual problem. And at that point, you really are confident that the student's needs may go beyond what can be addressed with just tier 2 intervention. and look then at making referral for individual problem solving. So, and within our system, with academics, and it's a bit different for behavior, but with academics, we like to really encourage all the referrals to come from the intervention review team, that team that is meeting every 6 to 8 weeks at each grade level. To review the progress of students in Tier 2 interventions. Because if you have a system, an MTS system that is functioning well at Tier 1 and Tier 2, then students should not be getting missed in terms of academic needs. And those students that do have significant needs should already have been placed in an intervention. And then you can be systematic in looking at which students really do need something more. So it's best that those referrals come from a team as opposed to individuals. There is a great deal of really strong evidence that there is a wide range of variability in referrals that do come from teachers. And there's just opportunities without the intention of anybody, but a lot of opportunities for variation in the needs of the students that do get referred, and sometimes our biases creep in, etc. So it's best to use a data-based approach for moving kids on in the process. Okay, so let's get down to the nitty-gritty of the individual problem-solving process. And I'm just going to quickly review that process in general. This is a slight variation on the process that we talked about before that actually had 5 steps, and just 2 of these were kind of collapsed at the end in this process. But I'm using this process today because it is essentially the same as what we reviewed before, and it matches more closely the specific tools and strategies that we have developed at Oregon RTI, which I will share with you. Which I have shared with you actually already in the supporting materials for this module. So anyway, step 1, problem identification. What is the problem? And that's where you take a general look at whether or not the student's performance is meeting the expectations that would be appropriate given that level, tier, and level of performance. So you identify whether there is a problem, and then you go to problem analysis. And that is where you take a much deeper, broader look at the student's needs, and you take a deeper, broader look at all the instructional, at the instructional environment, the instruction, the curriculum, the environment, and the setup of the classroom. And you really focus on all those variables that we can affect and control. But at that level, you're really trying to determine why is the problem occurring. We moved then to step 3, plan development, and that is where you take all that information that you've gathered, and the team looks carefully at all that information and really determines a plan that they feel will address the range of needs for that student. Again, and those range of needs may be beyond just academics, but it may include behavior, and often do at this level, or even some other variables outside of school that have to do with home support or whatnot, so that you're really looking again more broadly at a range of possible factors that could be affecting this child's performance and success at school. So what are we going to do about the problem? And then we implement that plan and we evaluate. And this is where those 2 components from the model we talked about earlier are just collapsed, so that it's implementation and evaluation. And it's really critical that you evaluate the plan, just like I described at Tier 2 or at any other level. You really need to make sure that the plan was implemented with fidelity. And it's probably more critical here than anywhere because the stakes are becoming high at this point. These are students that have received the other supports that the system has to offer, and we are really drilling down very deeply to what this student's needs. And if there's not adequate progress, then the next step would be to look at potentially a referral for special education evaluation. And in this kind of scenario, looking at these sorts of academics, most likely that would involve an evaluation for eligibility as a student with a specific learning disability. So we really want to be careful, and we want to be confident at this level that we really have delivered on that plan. All right, so we're going to get into now more specifically Um, the components of that evaluation, really the details of what you'll be looking at to determine the student's needs. And remember, we'll go back to that analogy we used before of the fish in the water. And we focus on the water. And in this case, that's the instruction, the curriculum, and the environment that that student is functioning in. The other component is learner, and it's not that we don't focus on the learner. We do, especially at this level, we take even a closer look at individual student variables, histories, characteristics, learning and language environment historically, etc. But the idea is that what we're going to focus on for our intervention are those environmental characteristics that will then affect the performance of that individual student. And we will tailor those interventions and supports around those specific unique needs of that individual learner. So I'm going to actually ask you to pause the video right now because we're going to talk a little bit about the problem-solving forms that we have. Now, those are documents that were included for you on Schoology, and if you haven't already, you might want to take a second to pull those up so that you can take a closer look at them. So you can pause right now, grab those if you would like, and then we'll move ahead. So you can see that our problem-solving form is organized around those 4 problem-solving components that we just reviewed. And step 1 being problem identification, step 2 problem analysis, step 3 is plan development, what are we going to do, and then step 4 plan implementation and evaluation. Now, I'm not going to go over these in tremendous detail. That really is beyond the scope of what we could have really accomplished today in a single session like this. But I do just want you to take a minute to look over that. And I'm going to talk about just some sort of general features of this problem-solving form. So again, step 1, problem identification, which we talked about earlier in database decision-making. Is organized around that concept of let's clearly define what expected performance would be. So at what level should the student be, let's say reading in this case, and you compare expected level to the student's present level of performance. Now that may vary, and it may not be reading, and it could be other academic subjects, or if we're looking at behavioral issues, it would be more focused on those kind of things. But typically academic issues, and we're looking at that magnitude of discrepancy. And this is, the first step at really identifying, is this significant? Is it significant, especially with respect to the interventions that the student has already had? So from that, you can get a clear problem definition, not only so it really focuses and clarifies what it is that you're going to be working on, but it also then leads to a formula for data analysis where you can look at progress monitoring and look at whether or not the student is making progress once the plan is being delivered. And then problem analysis is really where this gets interesting, complex, and fun if you're so inclined. So, and again, you're looking at instruction, curriculum, environment, and learner variables, both in core curriculum and in interventions that have been delivered before. When you're looking at learner characteristics, obviously you're going beyond core and intervention and really looking at that individual. And I'll go into this a little more later in terms of sources of information, but we typically look at doing a developmental history with the parent at this point so that you're really gathering information about other variables that might be impacting the student, whether those are health variables, whether those are issues at home in terms of support and things that might be affecting school, all sorts of things that may help you in really looking at what the students need, again, broadly. Okay, so problem analysis, and Then plan development takes that just one step farther, and or we have the form there that really organizes the information that you've gathered, and then a place to identify what the plan will be, what kind of materials will be used, who will be implementing, how often the support will be provided, as well as what is the fidelity plan and the data that will be collected for that. It is really important to clarify and put to paper and record all these pieces of the intervention plan. Again, I'm sounding like a broken record, but one of the ways, or the probably the most common ways or reasons that plans fail is not because they weren't a really well put together plan by intelligent people and skilled educators, but because with everything else that we've got going on, the plan just wasn't delivered as it had been intended. And again, at this level, we want to be confident when we say that the student needs to move on with a referral to special education or some other more intensive level of intervention. We want to be really confident that that the student really has that need, and it's based on their need, not a lack of having implemented the intervention. So anyway, and then, plan four, or excuse me, step four, plan implementation and evaluation. That last page of this form just is provides a really nice format for recording all that information in a systematic way, so you can take a really good look at whether or not the plan was truly effective. Okay, so let's look at then, so that's an overview of the process, and it's a beginning look at really some of the details that you'll be looking at, or at least the structure of how you're going to do that problem-solving process for this individual student. Let's take a look just at the team and team composition and what that looks like. Oops. So this typically is not another new team that you don't have. It's really restructuring the teaming process that's probably already in existence. Some people refer to them as SAT teams, SST teams, student study teams. That's historically how it's been referred to in places where I've worked, or a care team. And these are those teams that you have that meet to look at individual students. There's a couple of, I think, significant differences. One typically is that is a teaming process that is used with a lot of students. And if there's not an MTSS RTI system in place already, then there often aren't teaming structures that look more systematically at Tier 1, at Tier 2, and do a more efficient job of looking at more students, on a group level, and really using your time efficiently and effectively at those levels. So what happens often is then we use this general sort of teaming process, often a pre-referral team of some sort, and we look at a lot of students. We tend not to be as systematic. We tend not to be as data oriented. And so we can look at a lot of students, and we don't always come out of those teaming processes with really good, clear plans that are doable, and plans that we know we can implement and really carry out. So this individual problem-solving team and process really substitutes for those other teaming processes in many cases. All right, so I'm going to have you pause and reflect for a few moments here. We've been talking, again about this individual problem-solving process, and have, given you some foundational information about what that looks like, and just referred to there, talked a little bit about teaming processes. And what I'd like you to do now is take a moment, pause the video, and then just jot down on a piece of paper some answers to these questions. And what I'd like you to do is just really, reflect on what teaming practices you have in your school right now for addressing students with significant needs. What do you call that team? What is that team? Who are the members of that team? How often does it meet? What is the decision-making process? Is there a systematic process? And is the team successful in creating plans that improve student performance? So again, take a moment right now, pause, and then when we come back, we will look at the answers to just some of those questions in a individual problem solving process. All right, so let's now take a look, a little closer look at the team. So who is on the team in an individual problem solving process? We think of core team members and then some additional members as needed. Now, and that's because this team is really put together to meet, obviously, the address the needs of an individual student, and so the individual or the players on that team are going to vary. But in most cases, you're going to want your school psychologist and or your counselor. You're going to want a principal because, again, we're looking at some potentially pretty significant interventions that may occur, and we want to make sure that the principal is involved and that we know that we can support those and that we have the resources. And as students that are functioning at this level, it's just good for the principal to be involved in general with those students. Literacy specialists, a specialist, and a special education teacher are typically part of the core team because we're getting to that point in this process where we're bordering or bumping up next to the potential for special education referral. So variable depending on the student, the grade level teacher and teacher or teachers that know that student best and work with that student most closely. An ELL representative, if that's relevant, and the parent. So we do invite parents to these meetings or recommend, encourage the districts that we work with to invite parents to this meeting because you are gathering information more broadly and they can be a really critical source for that. Now, you can't always get the parent in, depending on your context. And so we don't feel like it's essential that it's required that they be there physically, but there really does need to be contact before the meeting. As I mentioned before, we highly recommend doing a developmental history if the case presents a need for that, but oftentimes something of that nature to get a good general history of the students, learning language and educational and otherwise history is important at this point. So, when do these meetings occur? For the individual problem-solving process, these typically occur in 2 meetings. An initial meeting to complete those steps 1 through 3, which are problem identification, analysis, and plan development. Like I just said. And once that team meets to complete those 3 steps, then the intervention is delivered and you come back for a second step. Now, let's go back just before that, though, to see how we get to that initial meeting. So again, these students should have been through a tier 2 level intervention, and you have a team that's reviewing those interventions on a regular basis. So when that intervention is being reviewed, that might be a place where you start the initial problem solving during that intervention review meeting if you have the data and time. Oftentimes you won't because in those meetings you're usually dealing with a number of students that are in intervention. But if you have the time and it's appropriate, you could start pulling together some of the existing information and doing some of the initial planning, looking at problem identification. Do you have adequate data already to determine whether or not there is a significant problem that has persisted despite intervention? And sometimes that is something that you can accomplish initially. But anyway, you move from that intervention team to gathering data and then having an initial problem solving meeting. At that point also, you notify the parent, and in the districts that we work with and districts that really do use an RTI process, they typically have a brochure that they put together that describes what the process is, the purpose and the types of supports and the sequence of events so the parents have an understanding of what will happen going forward from this point. And then that core problem solving team compiles data and determines additional data that is needed and collects that additional data. Okay. And again, at that point, you're completing steps 1 through 3, which includes plan development. The plan is then implemented. You intervene, and those interventions typically go for 6 to 8 weeks. That is a time frame that's not just arbitrary, but really gives enough time for the intervention to be implemented and for long enough to yield results if it is going to be effective. It's long enough time to monitor and make sure that things are happening according to the plan and to make adjustments as necessary. And then ensure implementation fidelity. And then you reconvene to evaluate the plan. So, just a little bit more about the information that you will be gathering. We talked some about it before, and that individual problem solving plan structures some of that. But when you're looking at instruction, curriculum, environment, and learner, here are just some guidelines for the kind of information that you'll be collecting. And we use the acronym RIOT to as a way to just remember and organize our thinking about that. So RIOT stands for review, interview, observe, and test. So those are 4 different kinds of ways that you can get information. So with review, you're reviewing the cumulative file and doing a careful review of that to organize all the pertinent information. It's amazing what can go by unnoticed often, year over year over year, and the student may have had other interventions. There may be significant medical events. One of the things we strongly encourage teams to always do is to look at attendance. And attendance can have a significant impact on performance, not only on a kind of immediate basis, but when there's a cumulative attendance problems. And I've seen this happen oftentimes in international settings because some students tend to move a great deal, and there may be just aspects of their living situation that are disruptive to regular attendance. But anyway, it can be a significant factor. So you're reviewing the file for not just attendance, but all those other kinds of things that could contribute and provide meaningful information. And then interviewing typically teachers to really get a good sense of what happens in their classroom instructionally. And more detailed information about students' performance and actions, behaviors, that sort of thing. And then also interviewing the student. I'm not going to continue to go through all of these, but I'll just mention quickly. Then observation. It's really critical that we have a direct observation of what's going on in the classroom so that we can really pin down, with more detail what the student's behavior and functioning is during those academic activities and otherwise, as well as what the instructional delivery is like from the teacher perspective. Are there opportunities to respond? Are there engagement strategies so that the student really is engaged in the instruction, et cetera, et cetera. And then opportunities to test. And so there may be more sort of diagnostic testing that would occur that looks more deeply into student skills. So the same then for types of data collection can be used to look at the curriculum and the environment and learner. So when we're looking about the environment, those questions to kind of focus on have to do with the physical setup, and is it really conducive to learning, and is it conducive to managing behavior in a really constructive, positive way so that you are able to keep students engaged, et cetera, et cetera. So, and again, their behavior management questions, like I just mentioned, student-teacher relationship, students' culture honored and valued. So are there, again, sort of cultural or language or learning history variables that may have, be sort of playing out in the classroom environment. Um, and then, and then focusing on the learner, and that's where that developmental history, information from the parents, and a good file review really can provide important information. All right, so that's part of how data is collected. We also provide, and you have access to another form that we have that helps structure some of that. So help structure your data collection so that you get really specific about what you need to collect, um, and who will collect it and what those findings are. So again, it's so important to really have a good plan that's structured so that we can make sure we really implement the plan. All right, and some of the priorities of information that you're going to be looking for, or the use of these different data gathering tools: observation, looking at all four of those factors, developmental history, record review, and additional diagnostic assessment. So those are the kind of things that invariably should go into a good individual problem-solving data collection process. Okay, so you've put together a great plan. You've really determined who's going to carry out the plan. You've been monitoring implementation of that plan, and you've been monitoring the progress of the student towards the goals for 6 to 8 weeks. You want to ensure fidelity, as we've talked about. If it was successful, then what do you do next? You may be successful, but you may determine that we still need to continue to have this plan in place in order to have the student continue to make that progress and really solidify the gains. So you may maintain, or there may be significant enough success that it may be reduced in some way. Typically, you really want to keep a plan in place more than just that first 6 to 8 weeks to make sure that there really is good, solid gains that are going to generalize and be sustained over time. Was it not successful? Not successful. And if it's not successful, then first option might be to modify and continue. And that's likely the case if this is the first phase, 6 to 8 weeks of individual intervention. So if it wasn't successful, evaluating what was done, evaluating the student behavior and performance after that time, to look at whether or not there are other things that should be added to the plan or intensified. But it's also possible that at this point, after a good plan has been implemented and after there has been a couple of group interventions at tier 2 prior, that you really do have enough data to say, yes, there are significant learning issues that don't seem to be accounted for by kind of environmental variables or the lack of, appropriate instruction and intervention. And it really is time to consider a referral for special education evaluation. And in the international setting, the rules and processes and criteria for that vary some, but certainly it's always the case that you would want to then continue to have the parent directly involved, and as they were at the start of this process as well, and meet to make that decision about whether or not an evaluation for special education is appropriate. And if it's agreed upon that it is appropriate, then the other piece that comes at that point is determining what that evaluation will look like. We're not going to really go into special education evaluation, but I'll just say a couple things about that at this point. Excuse me. People often, when they're new to an RTI process in general, and specifically when looking at an RTI process for identifying students as having a specific learning disability, there can be a misunderstanding that the evaluation is essentially done at this point, that you've provided these interventions, you've collected progress monitoring data, the student hasn't made progress, and that's what an RTI evaluation for special education eligibility with a student with specific learning disability. That's the whole thing. And there couldn't be farther from the truth. So if there is a determination that a special education evaluation is appropriate, then the same sort of procedural assurances go into place with an evaluation if you're using this methodology, and you have to determine what the components of a comprehensive evaluation would be. So just as with any other approach, and with an evaluation for other handicapping conditions as well, you really need to conduct a comprehensive evaluation. And by that, comprehensive is defined as taking a look, collecting data, information, evaluating any areas of suspected disability. So you have to look at the potential for other areas of disability, and you have to collect information that will meet criteria in those areas. So you do have a substantial amount of information from this process already that is key to an evaluation for specific learning disabilities within a RTI context, and valuable information that will be important to those ultimate decisions. But there certainly is other information that needs to be collected, and the process for doing that kicks in at this point. So that's all I'll say about that at this point. But anyway, here we are, kind of at the end of the individual problem solving process, at least as a general overview. And we're going to switch gears now from looking at using an individual problem solving process for academics to using that applied to behavior. So problem solving and functional behavior analysis, it should say. Intensive intervention, tier 3 for behavior. SMAPI, so that's the term that was used earlier in this course, perhaps by more than one of us, but SMAPI refers to smart and happy, and that's what we want our students to be. We want our students, in every case, to be having as much success academically as they can, and to be happy and feeling confident and successful in the school environment. So academics and behavior go hand in hand, and we've talked about this a bit before, but I'll just mention again that the two are so closely related. And for students that are struggling, it's really critical that we are looking at both of these aspects and supporting them appropriately, because not only for their well-being, but that we know that improvements in a behavioral domain is going to affect academic functioning and vice versa. So, take you back just briefly to the triangle and looking at the behavioral side of the triangle. And let's pull that out and just reorient ourselves quickly here. And we've talked about it earlier in terms of the tier 1 as a primary prevention, universal supports there, and then tier 2 with with group interventions, and then that third level where we apply the specialized individual interventions that are much more intensive. And I'm not going to go through this again, but I'll just note that the same sort of general process is involved with behavior as it was with academics. Okay? And there's a great deal of overlap in process, and there's a number of opportunities to really integrate these two systems together. Some of the academic and behavioral teaming practices are best done somewhat independently by the nature of the data that's being looked at, but I'll note as we go through this points where the same teams and team processes can be used that will include academic and behavioral data so that you're making decisions at tier 2 and tier 3 using information from both those domains to really have the most comprehensive and effective interventions. All right, so general processes at the advanced tiers, 2 and 3, with emphasis on tier 3 and individualizing. So when you're looking at behavior and the supports and interventions there, it's important to take a look back, just like we talked about with academics, and make sure that your tier 1 support is in place. And that then tier 2 and tier 3, as we'll get to in just a moment, is then linked to those earlier supports. So there's a continuum of service that builds upon one another. And again, just like we talked about with academics, you aren't then over referring students to the tier 3 individual problem solving process with behavior unnecessarily. Okay. So it helps to have a school-wide behavior team that oversees the process of school-wide supports, as well as tier 2 interventions, and then the provision of tier 3 individualizing. That's not always going to be the case, but it's important to at least have someone or a group of people looking at those systems to some degree. Okay, and then it's important to have decision rules for moving from one tier to another, so that it isn't an arbitrary decision or based on an individual an individual teacher's suggestion, just like we talked about with academic. But there are some decision rules that will guide students through moving through that process, so that you know that it's appropriate and necessary, and that we're not moving too many students forward that shouldn't be. Okay, now one of the differences here with in the behavior domain is, there are certain students' behavior that may be a safety risk that then would move them quickly to a tier 3 process and teaming process. I'll also note that with academics, the same is true to some degree. There's been a misunderstanding with RTI that you have to go through the tiers in a very lockstep process, and you have to demonstrate that you have not profited from at least one, if not two, tier 2 interventions before you could go to tier 3. And that's not the case. Certainly, we want to be careful not to move ahead too quickly, but if you have a student that enters your system, and it is clear from good, solid data and records and whatnot that they have very significant needs, you aren't going to start them with just a half an hour of support, daily on one isolated component of their academic skills. It's completely appropriate and recommended that if you have good data to say that what a student needs is more tier 3, maybe not individualized, but tier 3 intensive group kind of based interventions, then by all means move to that level sooner than later. Anyway, small digression, but so take a look at all the tiers in the behavioral domain, make sure things are intact, and then have someone or a group of people that are looking at that system and making sure things are working well. All right, we're going to do another pause and reflect here. So I'm going to want you to pause the video and get out a piece of paper and pencil again, and just do some reflecting on what you have in place at your school currently. So do you have a school-wide behavior program? Are there classroom and expectations for public places, and a system for teaching those and encouraging those and rewarding those in a way that's developmentally appropriate? So do you have something intact for school-wide tier 1, and is that linked to tier 2 and tier 3 supports? And then do you have a behavior team that guides the process like we were talking about, and do you have decision rules as we were talking about just a minute ago? So take a moment, pause, and think about those questions. All right. keep those in mind as we move forward and connect some of what we'll be talking about to the system that you have in place now. So let's take a look at teaming on the behavior side of the triangle at tier 1, 2, and 3. So it is like we've been talking about. It's good to have a team that is intact, that can look at the school-wide system, and be looking at data on a regular basis from that school-wide system to identify students that may need a tier 2 intervention. So just like with academics, you know, at least several times a year, but oftentimes with behavior, that team may be looking at school-wide data on a monthly basis. And again, through whatever tools that you've determined to use, or things that you want to measure. Mentioned before, office discipline referrals, attendance, or results from surveys that would probably be given less frequently, but to look more deeply at different externalizing and internalizing behaviors, taking that information and then determining which students might need more. And then at tier 2, you need to have someone that can be monitoring progress of the students that are in those interventions, reviewing that and looking at the effectiveness of those. And then at tier 3, a team or a person in particular that would be the primary person for conducting functional behavior analysis. And we'll talk about that in a minute more, and we're going to dig into that part of this equation next. Again, those teams are not necessarily a standing team that is meeting on a regular basis, but convene just like they are for academics on a case-by-case basis when there is student need. The other thing that I'll mention here is that this is a place, tier 2, is a place where you really, I would encourage folks, and we encourage schools, to integrate academics and behavior at your tier 2 meetings. So typically we recommend that at your tier 2 meetings that may be focused, primarily on students in academic interventions, you always want the counselor or the school psychologist or whoever might be delivering and or monitoring behavioral interventions at those meetings too, because it's just really critical to look at that functioning and that information simultaneously with academic information. So that's a really nice point of crossover. It's an efficiency for the system, and it just adds power to your ability to really determine what students need at that level. Okay, so we've talked about functional behavior analysis. What is functional behavior analysis? That's an individually applied assessment process that identifies the functions that maintain a behavior, and then that assessment process then leads to a plan. So when we say maintains a behavior, we're really looking at those consequences for behavior, negative, positive, whatever, but the things that happen after any given behavior that tend to keep that behavior going and maintaining it over time. So that's a general kind of concept. And how do the ABCs fit into FBAs? So we're going to have a little multiple choice test here. These are the options for what the ABCs are. Letters of the English alphabet, a sing-along song containing the letters of the English alphabet, antecedent behavior consequence, or all of the above. So really, what we're focusing on now is antecedent behavior consequence, although all of the above I think are true too. So more seriously, the ABCs of FBAs. So when we're talking about ABCs, we're talking about antecedent behavior and consequences. So antecedents are those conditions or those things that may then trigger or give rise to the target behavior or the behavior of concern. The other variable when you're doing a functional behavior analysis that also contributes kind of like an antecedent but not directly are what you call setting events. So those events or conditions in a person's life that make them, in a sense, more vulnerable to have one of these antecedents really trigger the undesirable behavior. So in this case, it mentions lack of sleep. I mean, I think we can all relate to that. If we're tired, we haven't had enough sleep, it's the end of a long day, we're worn out, our brain is just kind of crackling and not working very efficiently. And then we have something that for us is a challenge, and it's something that can really trigger then the less than optimal behavior on our part. Those setting events really make us much more likely to have that behavior pop up. Um, and the same with students. So you do want to look at those contextual variables, but then you're looking at specific antecedents, things in the student's academic classroom environment that lead to the behaviors that are of concern. And then, very importantly, you want to look at the consequences. What happens after the student does that? So, if math and just the math lessons are something that tend to be problematic times for this student, and that the student then often does not complete their work, is not engaged instructionally, then you want to look carefully at what happens after that. So, are they able to, effectively escape having to do that work? So that do they start to act out? Do they end up in a timeout? Do they engage in, some kind of other problematic behavior that functions to maintain the behavior that gets them out of that antecedent? So that's just a general kind of description of the concept behind this process, ABCs, using ABCs to conduct functional behavior analysis. General overview. And uh, typically FBAs are conducted by school psychologists that have been trained in conducting these sorts of analyses. It also may be counselors or perhaps other folks that have had that sort of training, but oftentimes it's a school psychologist. So what goes into an FBA? Same kind of information or sources of information that went into the individual problem solving. Review of file, interviews with the key player in that student's life, teachers, parents, others, specialists, or folks that have significant contact in other settings, and then observations to really get that kind of really good, concise information about ABCs, about the antecedents, what's going on when the problem behavior occurs, what does the problem behavior look like, and then what happens afterwards that may be maintaining that behavior. So anyway, we'll collect information in those categories as well as potentially other things. We talked about the who, and then when do we do that? When students are not responding to tier 2 supports, or the behaviors are becoming increasingly intensive or unsafe. Anyway, we already talked about that a little bit. So you're really determining the function of a student's behavior. And what we didn't talk about more already was that you really want to get that good comprehensive information so that you can put together a behavior intervention plan. Okay? So, continuing, collect information to determine function, develop a testable hypothesis. Fancy way of saying, given that information that you've collected initially, sort of like when we talked about with the academics, is there, can we identify a problem? And what do we identify as that, not just the problem behavior, but what do we identify as potentially those antecedents that trigger the behavior and those consequences that maintain the behavior. So with your initial information, you put together your best thoughts about really what is going on with that student and why it continues to occur. And then you go back and collect more specific data. So you really dig down deep through more review, interview, and observation to look at whether or not that hypothesis really seems to fit and really seems to be the case. So that initial look is more broad to identify what that potential, kind of series of events and consequences are that's maintaining the behavior, and then you collect more data to really test that out. And then the key thing here, and the really important part, is to move from a clear understanding of what's maintaining to developing and determining what some acceptable replacement behaviors would be. So we don't want to just squash undesirable behavior, and that does not work successfully. So what we need to do is identify a sort of a similar path that leads to a positive replacement behavior and some consequences that will maintain that positive replacement behavior over time, so that we provide the student with skills and the environmental variables that will help them develop new, adaptive, constructive, positive behaviors, so that they don't need to use those undesirable behaviors to cope with their situation. And from that, then we develop that behavior intervention plan. Again, you want to do that, develop that plan just like we talked about with academics, so that you're really careful to identify what's going to happen, who's going to do it, when it's going to get done, etc. And the procedures for monitoring the implementation of that plan and the response to that plan, so that you can assure that it's really happening as intended. Okay, so here's just a graphic that talks about or depicts what I was just describing in terms of providing an alternative path and alternative behaviors. So in it talks about the same kind of antecedent or setting events, antecedent, problem, and maintaining consequences that are currently happening, and then looking at some alternatives that will lead to both short-term goals and some short-term consequences, again, positive, constructive, that can be built in to maintain that behavior, as well as really looking long-term. What are we trying to accomplish? What kind of capacity do we want to develop in this student so that they can cope with these kinds of things in a sustainable way, and can generalize that to other challenging behaviors or challenging circumstances with constructive replacement behaviors. Okay, so we have gone through a review of MTSS in general. We've talked a little bit about the problem solving process in general, and we've defined and described what individual problem solving, database individualization is in a general way, and then we really kind of dug deeper into academics and behavior and applied those processes. So I hope that gives you a good sense of Tier 3 supports, interventions, data collection, plan development in both academics and behavior. So as this is Module 10, the last one of this series in this course, I want to just briefly then kind of pull these things together and look at a MTSS system and how these both fit in. To do that, I want to use a graphic that we use in particular and most often when we're trying to describe the RTI system for academics. But again, it applies to both. And so when we look at that comprehensive system, we're looking at assessment practices, we're looking at instruction in the case of academics, but also instruction when we're looking at behavior, because we, again, are really trying to provide skill development for students to have constructive, positive behaviors that lead to, positive outcomes and rewards that will maintain those behaviors. So it's both instructionally kind of is the foundation and orientation. And then the other pillar there is database decision making. So how are we using that data we collect at each one of those levels to make good decisions about what comes next and developing plans, etc. So starting with Tier 1, And we're looking at instructionally, we're looking at a research-based core curriculum with strong instructional practices, or in the case of behavior, we're looking at school-wide PBIS systems. When it comes to screening, and when we're looking at academics, that's typically done 3 times a year, fall, winter, spring. We use those CBM kind of measures to screen and identify um, 2 things. One, health of our core system, and then also which students need something more, i.e. a tier 2 intervention. Do the same thing with behavior. And With behavior, and I believe I mentioned this before, but you may actually look at that tier 1 kind of screening level data on a monthly basis, depending on the needs in your school. And as I mentioned, office discipline referrals, absences, rating scale information can all be used at that screener level. Okay, so then once you collect that information, then it's reviewed academically 3 times a year. Again, behaviorally, oftentimes it is monthly. And you look at where those red flags pop up. Who are the students that need something more? And so those students then move to tier 2 or 3 supplemental group interventions at that point. We monitor progress, both with academics and behavior. Then we have review teams that look at that progress monitoring data. As I mentioned before, and this is really a kind of a key and appropriate and important place to integrate both academics and behavioral information, are at those tier 2 intervention review meetings, where you're looking at students that have been receiving those interventions and how they're doing both academic and behaviorally, so that you can determine where you need to tweak, where you need to add something, where you need additional support. Okay. There we go. And then for students that have been in a tier 2 intervention, we review, the team meets, we look at whether or not they're making progress, and again, whether the intervention can be discontinued because they've made great, incredible progress for a long enough period that we're confident that that skill deficit has been remediated, and they're ready to, march forward without that support. Or Oftentimes there is a need for if the an additional tier 2, 3 intervention if the student wasn't making progress. So if the student's not making progress, you may modify, you may tweak, you may do those kind of things, or you actually may really add another intervention that is pretty significantly different. You may determine that you had selected the wrong uh, or a less than appropriate intervention program that really wasn't focusing on the key things that, after some additional data collection, you've determined to be really critical for that student, or whatever the case might be. But if the student's not making progress, oftentimes it's appropriate to have a second intervention to make sure that you can address the problems at that tier 2 level with a group level intervention. But again, after that second period, then the team will review information again, and you'll make a determination. If the student's still not making progress, that is when you move to a tier 3 intervention. And that's what we've been talking about today, either kind of a diagnostic individual problem solving process. And by diagnostic, we don't mean it's a bunch of individualized testing, but we mean that there's a real process for digging down and collecting all kinds of information about their academic environment and functioning. And in the behavioral domain, that's when you would conduct a functional behavior analysis. Student receives that intervention, problem solving team meets, and similar to tier 2, looks at whether or not there's been progress, looks at whether or not there needs to be another intervention or another intervention phase, if we need to modify, tweak, or whatever. If the student's been making great progress, then wonderful. We may maintain that for a while, or we may drop that intervention off. If the student's not making progress, and another red flag pops up, that's when we really consider whether or not there should be a referral to special education. The And then again, as mentioned before, that's when you conduct a comprehensive evaluation, whether that's in the academic domain, behavioral domain, or with respect to another handicapping condition that may have emerged as relevant through this process. So let's say there is an evaluation and the student is found eligible and then is put on an IEP. That is not the end of the RTI or MTSS system for that student. We often have people sort of misunderstand that once you go into special education, then you aren't a part of this process anymore. Your name is not on that list at the Tier 2 interventions, even if you are in a group delivered academic or behavioral intervention. Far too often people then kind of silo kids that are on IEPs, and that absolutely should not be the case. Those students, every bit as much as, and obviously in many cases more so, need to be in that system that's providing an ongoing look at their progress, an ongoing analysis of whether or not their needs are being met, and they need to be have access to all the resources in that system. Oftentimes, historically, those students will just then be getting services, or at least the supplemental services, from a learning specialist, or and possibly in a another classroom, and not be receiving the whole host of supports, intervention, instruction that they should be getting as well from Tier 1 and in Tier 2 interventions, where they may oftentimes be an intervention with students that are not on an IEP. But at any rate, all students are really part of an RTI system. It's not just the students that we think of in those Tier 2 or 3 interventions. They're all RTI kids. If you have a comprehensive system for RTI or MTSS, and you should, that includes behavior as well, then all kids are in that system at all times. And important to note again that Tiers 2 and 3 supplement, not supplant. So students, even though they're getting those other interventions, stay in Tier 1 so that they can receive all the benefit that Tier 1 has to offer in terms of exposure to ideas that they or concepts and skills that they may not have yet but are working towards, so that whatever in supplemental instruction they're getting is connected and makes sense and is articulated with what's happening broadly. Because our goal for all these kids, all of our students, is continue to move back towards as much independence and having as much as their school day in Tier 1 as possible. And it really is doable and attainable. It's amazing to look at the effectiveness, of really good evidence-based interventions that are delivered systematically and with fidelity. And many kids have those skill deficits addressed and remedied through those interventions, and are able to then function at a level that's appropriate for their grade level and without extra support. So that brings us to the end of this module and to the end of the course, or at least the beginning of the end with this module. So I just want to leave you with some thoughts for taking what we've talked about today and extending that. So some options for exploring and deepening your understanding. I think it would be really interesting to take what was shared about the IPS process, individual problem solving, those forms that we provided you with, and really look at whether or not that could be applied in your setting to a student that perhaps is struggling despite receiving interventions. So that's something you might want to do and look at. Again, I haven't provided you enough detailed information in just this one session to really feel like I don't expect that you would feel like you have a really good understanding of the details, but I think with these forms and with the general overview that we've had, that if you put your head together with someone else, you could really explore that and see how you might be able to apply this process, maybe not with the same specificity, but at a general way to students that you're working with. Another option would just be to get with the person in your school that conducts those FBAs. Like I said before, oftentimes a school psychologist, but whoever. And if that's not something that you've been exposed to or aware of before, might be an interesting way to just have a discussion about the basic concepts you've learned here and how it's really done in real life in your setting. And then I've just provided some more websites. I've already given you the ORTI website before, but anyway, some more websites for really looking at and digging deeper into intensive interventions with respect to what we've done today, but then more broadly, the RTI Action Network that has all kinds of resources and really accessible, usable information for strengthening RTI processes in general across the tiers. So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for participating, and I will be signing off. Good luck in moving forward, applying what you've learned, and continuing that process.